Hello and welcome to the first of this season's weekly recap. My name is Pomman. I'm a coach in the NPL Minors League, and I have a co-host for this series. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello all, it's Dave.
Yes. So we're going to be recapping the games that happened each week and giving our thoughts on them, where the game was won and how we think each player played. And so let's just jump right into it with the Atlanta Braviaries versus the Phoenix Sunken. Now, the Atlanta Braviaries are coached by Trev the King, and the Phoenix Sunken are coached by Cheeseboys28, as you can see. So, at the team matchup, I was thinking it was fairly neutral. Both players had their winning chances, but both of them had to play well to get around what checked their winning chances. And so I did think it came down to who played better on the day. So let's just jump right into the game. We see the turn one, Latias versus Blissey, and Trev makes a very good prediction. He knows that the Latias is probably going to be a trick scarf variant of some sort, and he switches in his physically defensive Togekiss, and then makes another good prediction turn two, and switches back into his Blissey on the Diancie switch. Now, turn three is when things started to get a little bit interesting in this game, as the Blissey sets up Stealth Rock on the Diggersby switch, and then goes for Fire Blast on the Diggersby SDing, trying to break any sash or something. And now he's facing down the nose of a +2 Diggersby, and he has to just let his Blissey go. And that's pretty big, because that means he has basically nothing anymore to take on that action zone. He just needs everything else in his team.
Nothing really wanted to take a +2 Diggersby attack either, so he had to end up sacking something.
What I do think he could have done better, though, I do think he could have gone out into Togekiss on the return, not the return, on the Swordsman turn, because he revealed in his video later that it was physically defensive Togekiss. I'm going to confuse them the entire season, and I apologize for that. But yeah, he could have taken the return, and it is his check to it. He does go into it after he killed the Blissey, and it is just 3-hit KO'd by the quick attack. And that is a little bit sad to see, because it means that the Togetic can't take on the Diggersby. And it's looking really bad until he reveals a very well-prepared set, the Water Shuriken Greninja, allowing him to pick up the kill on the Diggersby, stop the sweep, as it was, and give him some good chances going into the rest of the series. Now, Cheese goes into Medicham and tries to double into Magnezone on the Blade switch, but Trevor feels that he has Protect on his Greninja, trying to save him from any fake-out damage or any high jump kick, if that was what the Medicham wanted to go for. And he's Greninja versus he doesn't have his Blissey anymore, so he has to let his Greninja go, which is kind of unfortunate. It kind of won the game as well, if he played his cards right. But now he goes out into Emboar, which has a grand total of 0 switch-ins, and the Latias almost drops immediately to the combination of the Flare Blitz plus Burn. It does get the opportunity to get off a Healing Wish to bring the Magnezone back up to full, but he's still got to try and switch into the choice-banded Flare Blitz Reckless Emboar, which is not an easy feat. He ends up going out into Diancie, and it was a roll to 2-hit KO, and Trev didn't get the roll, which is somewhat unfortunate for him. We actually see that comes very close to it going anyway with the second Flare Blitz, but the Diancie manages to pick up the kill on the Emboar. So the Reuniclus comes in and sets up a Trick Room, and that is scary, because Reuniclus under Trick Room outslows the entirety of Cheeseboy's team and can do a lot of damage. Psyshock kills the Diancie. He goes out into Medicham to fake out, just wasting turns of Trick Room, and then Shadow Ball gets a kill. He manages to 2-hit KO the Magnezone this time, and so after the Magnezone drops, the Trick Room also drops that turn as well, and it's a matter of 50-50 here for Cheeseboy. does he go in? He goes out into Medicham, and he can either switch into Gengar on the Doublade switch, in which case he's got a pretty good shot of winning because the roll from Shadow Sneak doesn't kill, or he can stay in and kill off the Reuniclus. He chooses to switch out into Gengar, and he gets killed by Shadow Ball, meaning that Blade can just game.
That was the nail in the coffin right there, in my opinion.
That was the nail in the coffin. He was in a poor position, but he had to try and bring it back. Had to try and hope that was going to play the differential. He didn't. He ended up killing off the Reuniclus, but the Doublade is, I think, one of the only counters to Medicham there is. And, so the rest of the game is just Doublade tanking a couple bullet punches and killing Shadow Sneak. Now, I personally really enjoyed this game. I didn't know who was going to win until the third to last turn, and both players still had their winning chances. They both played well with their win conditions. That, in my personal opinion, at the very least, that Diggersby was so scary. And I think it was a case of good preparation on Trev's part with the Water Shuriken Greninja. Ended up winning him the game, that he was in such a terrible position, and he managed to pull it back and win. What were your thoughts, Dave?
I thought it was pretty much the same thing. Like, once the Diggersby set up, it was a very big threat against Trev in the beginning of the match, so he pretty much had to sack off something, at least in the beginning, and then just revenge kill it with Greninja.
Yeah.
But the real event was at the very end when, in my opinion, when Trick Room ended in Cheese Boy sent in Medicham instead of Gengar, instead of killing it off.
The reason that happened was that he was trying to avoid the roll from Shadow Sneak on the blade, because after a round of Life Orb damage from Shadow Ball hitting the Reuniclus and killing it, the Blade had a pretty good chance to kill with Shadow Sneak, and so he had to try and guard into his Gengar and win from there. But it didn't end up working, unfortunately. Well, fortunately in Trev's point of view, but for Cheese Boy it was unfortunate that was his best chance of winning. I do like the fact that Trev didn't try and play for differential because he had a guaranteed win the way that he played it.
Gotta say though, Physical Greninja is pretty unpredictable. I do like that set.
It was mixed Greninja though. It showed a Dark Pulse on the Magnezone.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Yeah, I too very much enjoyed the Greninja set. That's where I think that the turn 3 really came into play, because if he switched out into Big Kiss immediately, he would have still had the Blissey for the Magnezone, so he wouldn't have sacked off his Greninja, and it would have been able to put a lot more pressure onto Cheese Boy's team. Okay, so the next game that we have is versus the Portland Timbers and the New York Metangs. I'm so close to saying the New York Yankees from the UVA. But yes, Portland Timbers are the Togevoir, and the New York Metangs are tapped. And so on team matchup, I'm seeing a grand total of 1 Mega Gardevoir switching, and I'm thinking that Gardevoir is so threatening to the team that Taft has brought, and yeah, just. But at the same time, the potential of a Thunderous Carrying Speed should be overlooked. So let's just get into the game. And so we see the leads as the Nidoqueen leads off versus the Porygon 2, and takes the Tri-Attack like it doesn't bother it because it's Stealth Rock. And then we see the switch into Terrakion on the Tri-Attack. He doesn't get burnt, nor paralyzed, nor freeze, so he's very lucky. And he sets up a substitute on the Thunder Wave, and now it's just time to wreck house. The Terrakion just destroys the Porygon 2, and it takes a good 60% out of the Donphan as well, and so forces him into Earthquake to break the substitute. He switches out, fearing the potential Ice Shard, and he can come in later and just wreck again on versus anything slower than it, really, because it can Tokyo everything. We see the Azumarill switch in. Aquajet knocks out the Donphan. And then we see the Tornado Starion come in, go for Thunderbolt on the Nidoqueen, and then go for Psychic, as Togebar reveals that he had Payapa Berry Nidoqueen, which I thought was very interesting and very good preparation. And he goes for Shadow Ball, trying to catch the Hooper on the switch. I think he should have Ice Beamed there, because Nidoqueen normally does outspeed Hooper unless it's Scarf. But I suppose that he might have not been fast enough to outspeed Max Speed Hooper. And so, yeah, probably Shadow Ball was a smart play. But there was no risk in going for Shadow Ball, and that's the important thing. He switches out into his Cresselia, because he knows that it can take anything that this Thundurus wants to go for, as he just kills off the Thundurus with a Psyshock on his taunt. Well, the taunt fails that means that the Cresselia can't Calm Mind up, but otherwise he just killed off the Thundurus. And now the Cresselia is in versus the Hooper, and it goes for a Shadow Ball. Cresselia lives by the skin of its teeth and goes for its own Shadow Ball, and Hooper takes it very well indeed, because
really surprising.
Cresselia isn't very strong, and yeah, I'm not too surprised by that, as we do see the Gardevoir switch in, and there are a grand total of 0 switch-ins anymore. Path does just sack off his Zygarde, and because Hyper Voice just destroys it, and then goes out into his Cobalion. And sorry, the nicknames were just weird. He actually goes out into Hooper. My apologies, I forgot, because he Destiny Bonded the Gardevoir and allowed his Cobalion to be taken down by the Milotic. I thought that this was just a case of very good, very solid preparation by Toge. He brought Payapa Berry, Nidoqueen, knowing the risk of the Psychic on the Thunderstarian. He brought 2 fairies when his opponent really didn't have anything solid to deal with fairies. The best he could do was outspeed them with something that can switch in. He brought a Subterrakion to take on the Porygon 2, and it did its job perfectly. And honestly, I just think this was a case of being very well prepared by Toge, and I think he deserves some plaudits for a very good, very solid 4-0 at the beginning of the season.
I must agree, though. I mean, this whole battle was it all just came down to team preparation. I mean,
yeah.
When I came down to watching the videos, it was revealed that the Donphan had Gunk Shot, which could have done a lot of damage to the Azumarill. So I just think there was a slight misplay on that. In addition, though, he also revealed that his Zygarde only had Dragon-type moves on almost a Fairy-type team.
Versus a team with 2 very good, very strong Fairy types. I don't really agree with bringing only Dragon moves Zygarde. I honestly don't really know what was on Zygarde instead of something like Earthquake to try and hit the Gardevoir on its paper-thin defenses. But he did still have ways of winning, but I think this was just a case of Poe played extremely well and prepared extremely well and did extremely well in general.
Hey, one more comment. I mean, I haven't had too much experience with the new ORS metagame, but I gotta say, Hoopa has really high special defense.
Yeah,
like the
I
fact
wasn't
that
expecting it to take the the 4 times weak Shadow Ball very easily, and it took it very well indeed. So our next game is between the San Antonio Swamperts and the Oakland Roserades, and at team matchup, I'm thinking this is, like our first game, pretty neutral. I feel like both players have winning chances, and I'm interested in seeing how the rest of the game plays out. Turn 1, we see Scarf Staraptor versus a Tornado Starion, and he goes for the final gambit with Scarf Staraptor, but it's actually Scarf Tornadus Terrian as well, and he misses a Hurricane, and that's pretty big for the rest of the game, because that Tornadus Terrian could have been really useful in the rest of the game, just dealing with the Lopunny, being able to pivot around Sableye and the Vaporeon as well, and that was pretty big turn 1 miss. So then we see a double down with the final Gambit, obviously taking out the Tornadus on the Hurricane miss. We see the Oakland Roserades going for the Stealth Rock with their Mamoswine on the Conkeldurr's knockoff. A good prediction on their part, but it was Focus Sash, so it wasn't really that risky. He does then go out into his Sableye on a Mark Punch, a good read again, goes for the knockoff, knowing that it's going to be probably Guts Conkeldurr, and not wanting to take extra damage. He crits the Sableye, getting rid of its leftovers with knockoff. It didn't matter that much because he did obviously have the recover, and he was back up at full when the Conkeldurr switched out anyway. As he goes out into his Rotom and burns the Sableye with Will-O-Wisp, he gets knocked off for his trouble, getting rid of his leftovers. That Stealth Rock damage will now be permanent. And he's less of a threat to Mamoswine now, which is kind of unfortunate, as he actually does hard switch into Mamoswine on the Will-O-Wisp. So the Mamoswine is quite neutered and not really that much of a threat. He gets off the Stone Edge damage on the Overheat, leaving the Rotom low, but Rotom does manage to kill the Mamoswine. Lopunny now comes out, and Lopunny is a pretty big threat to the Swampert's team. We see the Gothitelle come in and try and trap it, knowing that it can live any one frustration, and it goes for the Psyshock and gets a mid-range roll. I'm assuming with this team that it was Modest Choice Scarf, just based on the roll, and if he was running Psychic instead of Psyshock, it would have almost certainly killed. It was a 99.6% chance to kill. And so that's just a little bit of poor preparation, but I suppose it was mainly for the potential Spadef walls that Richard Arison could have brought, and oh well, it happens. Now this is where the Scarf Tornadus T would have been very useful to come in and just U-turn killed, got the momentum, etc, etc. But the Gothitelle does go down to the frustration, and he goes out into his Conkeldurr. He goes for the Mark Punch on the Sableye switch. Again, not fantastic, but oh well, there's not much you can do about it. He finally gets burnt by the Sableye, meaning that his knockoff can no longer just be out-recovered, especially given that the Sableye itself is burnt. And he just continues. He switches out into his Alakazam on the good play there, and goes for a substitute on the switch out into the Vaporeon. Now this is looking like a really good position for Dallas to win in, because obviously the Vaporeon can't really do that much to an Alakazam behind a sub, but he actually does reveal that he has Roar on this Vaporeon, bringing in the Conkeldurr, which can threaten out the Vaporeon quite well with a Gut Strain Punch. He goes for the knockoff, a nice prediction, expecting the Sableye, and then goes out into his Alakazam again, trying to catch some damage on the Vaporeon. He crits the Mega Alakazam with a burned Shadow Sneak. I personally think that might have mattered, but I'll get into that later. As we do see him go out into his Lopunny, trying to fire off a nice fake out, get some nice damage on. Goes out into Landorus. I'm not entirely certain I agree with that. I think that he could have gone out, he could have just sacked off his Alakazam at that point and gone out into his Conkeldurr and threatened the rest of his team, maybe made a nice prediction, get a Brain Punch back to full health, and he could have won the game from there, but it was a prediction game, and it's not like he's against someone who's going to just let him do whatever he wants. Goes for the Mark Punch on the Vaporeon switch and gets a little bit of health. He doesn't actually. I completely messed that up. He actually switches out into his Alakazam, trying to get the Water Absorb back up to about 45% or so. Kills the Vaporeon, and then the Lopunny can just clean up the game somewhat. Sacks off his Conkeldurr, and just because the Alakazam does have one Stealth Rock switch in left, he gets a better differential this way, and he actually reveals that he's Quick Attack Mega Lopunny. So it does end in a 2-0 win for the Oakland Roserades, and it was a pretty good game overall. My big complaint with the game is that I think that Dallas played a little bit too obviously. The majority of the turns that Conkeldurr was in, he went for the attacking what was in front of him option, and he didn't make any particular predictions. He made one versus the Mamoswine and one versus the Vaporeon, predicting the Sableye to come in. It worked once, and versus the Mega Lopunny, if he went for Drain Punch in the final turns, he might have had better winning chances. But this is pretty nitpicking, because Richard played very well in this game, and as did the Swampert. He did do his best to maximize his winning chances, and I think this was a pretty good game. A little bit, I think that the sidekick would have been a good choice on Gothitelle for this game. The Shadow Sneak crit might have mattered because it might have Alakazam out of the quick attack range. Well, not the quick attack range, the fake out range when it was at 45% instead of 30%, and it might have affected the way the two players played. Probably didn't matter that much in terms of the outcome of the game, but it might have made the 2-0 a 1-0 loss instead. What were your thoughts, Dave?
I mean, you pretty much just put it in perfect words. I mean, I think he actually used his Mega Zam fairly well, especially against Vaporeon, because he kept tracing that Water Absorb and tried to switch in on any potential scalds to get that recovery boost. The moment of the match where it was Gothitelle versus Lopunny, I was curious, and we ran the calculations, and it would have been a pretty big roll if he ran Psychic instead of Psyshock. I'm really curious.
I think the big moment of the match was that turn 1 final Gambit versus Tornadus as the Hurricane missed, because the Hurricane miss mattered a fair amount.
That was my favorite part of the battle.
Well, I think that if the Tornadus had still been alive, I think that would have been a big advantage for the Swamperts, and I think that they... I'm not going to say outright would have meant that they would have won, because at that point both teams still had very good winning chances. I just think it would have definitely affected how both players played and could have been very decisive in the end result.
I agree. I'm actually also curious to know how the Zoroark would have worked, because we didn't see that thing the entire match either. How
do you know? Yeah, I do think that the Zoroark could have been very interesting. I'm imagining it would have had Sucker Punch because of how many things on the Swamperts team do outspeed it, but it would have been interesting just to see how it was played around and how it was played by Richard. But overall, I think both teams prepared fairly well, and Richard just had a slight edge in the battle itself, aided, of course, by the Hurricane hacks. But it's Hurricane. It'll happen. That's been known since Hurricane was implemented, unfortunately. Okay. So let's move on to the next game between the Toronto Staraptors and the Washington Charizards. Looking at this team matchup, I think that Jolt, the coach of the Toronto Raptors, definitely has a pretty good team matchup here. Also interesting, they played this at level 50, by the way, in a custom game, so that was very interesting. I think that he's got the matchup just because the Mega Latios is so versatile, and he's not really got any solid answers for it on Nixon's, but Nixon doesn't have any solid answers for it, of course. And the dual fighting core looks really threatening, with the best fighting resist being Slowking, which doesn't take on either Lucario or Brailium very well. And he has got two fighting weaknesses as well in the Heatran and the Snorlax. At the same time, though, he does have winning potential with a potential SD Mega Scizor, and possibly if he can use his Snorlax well. But I would say that the team matchup in preparation does probably go to Jolt, in my opinion. So let's just jump in then. Turn 1, we saw the Jolteon versus Clefable. The Jolteon just Volt switched out, doing 45% to Clefable, so both players can get a gauge of each other's EVs and what set they are. Clefable goes for the Stealth Rock on the Snorlax switch, and then just goes for Protect. Scouting out what the Snorlax will do. He goes for the Body Slam, predicting the switch out. Just trying to get any potential power on either of those two fighting types. As he goes for Body Slam on a Wish. And as we see later on in this game, it's actually Heavy Slam Snorlax. And if you went for Heavy Slam there, it was a roll to knock out the Clefable, so that was an interesting turn. The next few turns were just a matter of Wish, Protect, Stallings, scouting out the Snorlax's move, start trying to get a free switch into one of the main sweepers of the team. And he switched his Gliscor into a Heavy Slam, just making sure that he gets the Toxicorp active, and then he pivots back out into Clefable, just scouting for the Ice Punch, as it's revealed that the Snorlax does in fact have it, so very well played there by Jolt. As we see the same thing again, just Whips, Protect, Stalling by Clefable on the Snorlax, because it is a pretty big threat for his team, and we see in the end, Jolt switching out into his Lucario on a Heavy Slam, and then it's just a matter of breaking everything. This is a banded Lucario, and it's solidly 2-hit KOs the Fangrowth. And then Nixon does a series of plays I don't really agree with. He pivots around the choice banded Lucario into his Slowking and his Fangrowth, both of which get 2-hit KO'd after rocks. So neither are a solid switch-in. And he ends up sacking off his Mega Scizor before it even had the chance to Mega Evolve to possibly take it. And yeah, that was potentially pretty... I think that was pretty poorly played, because he left his wall core of Slowking and Growth weakened for Jolt to exploit later on. He does eventually revenge kill the... he doesn't revenge kill. He goes out into Jolteon to revenge kill the Lucario, but he has a Breloom that he can switch out into and tank the Volt Switch, get his Toxicorp active, and try and set up with his Breloom to win. He reveals that he actually has substitutes on this Breloom. It's a quite interesting set that I've not seen before. We see the Seed Bomb doing next to nothing to the Tangrowth, only 10%, but the Tangrowth stays in, reveals Poison Jab on the bulk up. Poison Jab was probably for the Clefable, and then the Hidden Power. It could have been Ice or Fire, and I would imagine it would be Ice on that team. He sets up another bulk up with his Breloom and goes straight for the Drain Punch, hoping to kill the Tangrowth. It does 37%, because Tangrowth is so bulky. And he's out of range of the Hidden Power, though, because of the bulk up giving him, not bulk up, the Drain Punch giving him some recovery. And he goes for Drain Punch again, and he's left at 36% against a Jolteon. And so the Jolteon just goes for the Hidden Power, Ice on the Clefable switch. And now he switches out into his Heatran on the Clefable, double into Tentacruel. The Tentacruel can take on the Heatran very well. It's a very nice prediction on Jolt's part, as we see the Tentacruel set up a layer of Toxic Spikes after going for a Scald on the Slowking switch. This wear down the Snorlax and the Jolteon even more. The Slowking is able to take out the Tentacruel after he goes for another Scald. He doesn't get the burn, which is quite nice for Nixon. At this point, it's just looking very, very difficult for him to get back into this game. Breloom ends up killing off the Slowking, and he does go back out into his Jolteon again, goes for the Hidden Power. He actually goes for the Volt Switch. I'm sorry, messed up my turns there for a moment. and goes out into Heatran on the Drain Punch, does a good chunk of damage, and that tells Jolt that this Heatran is probably going to be faster than his Bravelium because he's specifically EV'd for specially defensive Heatran, and that Heatran didn't take it like a Spadef Heatran would. So we do see the Fire Blast, which does confirm that it is probably offensive, and it just kills the Gliscor. But now Jolt goes out into his Latios, and he is physical Latios with Earthquake and Dragon Dance. And at this point, he Earthquakes on the Snorlax switch in case the Heatran decides to try and stay in. And then he just sets up a Dragon Dance. He doesn't get fully paralyzed by the Body Slam, and he can just clean up the game with Earthquake. With Dragon Claw and Earthquake. Dragon Claw on the Snorlax, and then Earthquake on the other two things. And I thought that this was an example of good preparation and good playing by Jolt. He just seemed very on form in this game. The way he played around the Snorlax with his Fable and bringing in his Gliscor and his Lucario on attacks that wouldn't really hurt them, and just firing off banded close combat with Lucario, just watching things drop must have been very, very cathartic for him. Very nice to watch. What do you think, Dave?
I agree. I mean, looking at that band of Lucario, it just does so much damage, even to max defensive walls such as Tangrowth and possibly Slowking. And I do think Nixon misplayed with them somewhat, because I think I could tell what he was trying to do. He was trying to keep switching in Tangrowth and Slowking for the Regenerator boost and the Rocky Helmet damage onto Lucario.
Yeah, the only problem with that, though, is that they were getting hurt more than they were recovering with the Regenerator, and it ended up to the point where he did end up having to sack his Mega Scizor, which could have been very important.
Losing his Mega Scizor was one of the big turning points in this battle, because it was practically his only counter for Jolt's Mega Latios.
But it was just a pretty good game all around, in my opinion. Good preparation by Jolt, and a couple of misplays with the walls by Nixon. I do like the Snorlax set that he brought, and I thought it was pretty neat and pretty interesting to watch. And so we'll move on to the next game between the Montreal Valiants and the St. Louis Reshiram's. And from team preparation, I think that Matty has brought a very good team versus Dave Vernape's Pokemon. It's just so threatening and very difficult to play around. He's only got a couple half checks in the Keldeo and the Granbull, neither of which really enjoy taking Crawdon on. On the bright side, though, everything does outspeed it. So he's EV Granbull for it, and the Charizard is a potential threat to his own team. So we see turn 1, Tyranitar versus the Granbull. The Granbull goes straight for a Thunder Wave on the Amoonguss switch. He didn't want to get his Tyranitar crippled by that. It's a possibility that he's Sandrock Tyranitar at this point, because we don't know his item, obviously, and he does have that Stoutland in the back. So we see the Mandibuzz switch in on a Toxic as it gets a little bit worn down by that, unfortunately. And Tyranitar switch in is met with a Slowbro switch in, and Slowbro goes straight for a Focus Blast, which does a ton to that Tyranitar as it sets rocks on it, but it doesn't kill. And now he switches out his Tyranitar into his into his Fortress, as the Fortress gets burnt by the Scald on the switch in. A little bit unfortunate there, but that's Pokemon and that's Scald as well. So he does just Volt Switch on the Mandibuzz. We see how much that did, and it did basically nothing with 12% by the Fortress. So we know that this Mandibuzz is probably defensive, as he can just bring in his Crawdon safely and go straight for Crab Hammer and watch something drop. The Keldeo comes in to try and revenge kill, and he switches out into Charizard on a predictable into the Amoonguss. He actually gets Fortress in, but it's neither is a Pokemon that wants to take Charizard on, as he does just Mega Evolve into Charizard X and Flare Blitz. The Fortress drops as a result, but the Fortress wasn't really doing anything for the rest of the game anyway. He goes out into Tyranitar to set his sand up, and the Charizard switches out into Slowbro on the Stone Edge. We see it do a pretty decent chunk to Slowbro, and so he decides to switch back out into his Keldeo, get a free switch on the Crunch, as it does 25%, and the Keldeo gets the attack raise. It didn't matter because no Keldeo is physically offensive, and the Keldeo just goes for Secret Sword on the Amoonguss switch in, but Amoonguss is pretty much a hard counter to Keldeo at this point. Can't even get burnt to get worn down by Scald. He switches out into his Charizard as the Clear Smog does manage to kill it, and we see the Weavile come in afterwards trying to kill off the Amoonguss, but he doubles on the predicted switch into Slowbro, trying to catch the switch into the Tyranitar to sap it, or just anything else, but he does go for the Giga Drain on the Amoonguss. A good play there, as the Slowbro does go for the Psychic, does a chunk to the Amoonguss, and the Amoonguss gets fully paralyzed, and Dave then goes out into Gramble on the Giga Drain, and looks like he is just sacking off his Amoonguss, which is a little weird considering that Keldeo is still a pretty big threat, but we see Flamethrower from Gramble fail to 2-hit KO the Amoonguss, and Amoonguss manages to land a Toxic on the Gramble, and finally the Amoonguss switches out, and Infernape comes in on the Flamethrower. Now, this Infernape is a pretty big threat to every team there is, and it OHKOs the Gramble immediately with a Life Orb Fire Blast, and that's looking pretty threatening then if it's special, because it's a matter of speed tying it with Keldeo, and the other two Pokemon can drop to various coverage moves that special Infernape can run. Crawlaunt comes out on the predicted Scald, it avoids the burn somehow, I don't know how, and it just kills the Keldeo with a knockoff, and we will see that it was in fact Choice Scarf Keldeo. So the Crawlaunt is in versus the Weavile, and goes for the Aqua Jet on the Slowbro switch, but there's not enough turns for him to stall out the Life Orb, and Weavile does go down to the Life Orb knockoff, as will the Crawdaunt. And this, not as will the Crawdaunt, as will the Slowbro. What am I talking about? My apologies. Yes, so that was a pretty good display of very solid preparation by Matty. He brought an Amoonguss, countered half of his opponent's team, and played really well with a very threatening breaker in Crawdaunt. And I just think that this was a very good showcase by Matty, that he's very good at this format and very good at preparing. What do you think, Dave?
Well, first off, I just gotta say that his Crawdaunt is possibly the scariest thing that I've ever seen. I mean, he's beaten you with that thing, I don't know, 5 times at least. So I just know how scary that thing can be.
Yes.
But I mean, Matty has a great team set up. I mean, his team works great with Sand. He has that Sandrush Stoutland in the background that we didn't see in the battle, but I'm sure it would have done great.
Yeah, could have been.
His Amoonguss was great at disrupting any kind of like threats that was on the other team. Like, he used it as a really strong pivot switch for the most part.
Yes, I was very impressed by the way that he played with the Amoonguss on the switch with the Slowbro and the Granbull when it was his last real check to the Keldeo. And yeah, I was very impressed by the fact that he was willing to play that aggressively with it, despite the fact that if it went down, he didn't really have a good Keldeo answer, aside from maybe Tita and up, but I don't know how solid an answer I would call that. Yeah. But
on the other hand, Dave does have that element of surprise, especially with that Gramble. I mean, it has Thunderwave, but I've never seen a specially offensive Gramble like that before.
Nor have I. I was interested by that, but he did bring the American shit, and it was unfortunate for him. Yeah. So yeah, that was a pretty good showcase by Matty, and I think that that's all that really needs to be said on that game. So for the final match this week, it was the Colorado Avalanche versus Manapee City, and from team preview, I was quite confused with Colorado Avalanche that they didn't bring a default user, especially when they had Mew in the back. Just because of how much Chansey in particular really hates spikes and back. But it's a matter of fitting all you need to in six slots. I mean, if he had a seventh slot, he would have loved to bring Mew, but you can't always get what you want. But I thought that this was a pretty even matchup. The Pincer is looking potentially pretty threatening if you can get a sword stance on the Chansey, which is obviously something that the Avalogs will be doing their best to prevent. Then it can break apart teams pretty solidly. Obviously, the Hooper is, in my opinion, one of the most threatening Pokemon you can ever face. But he does have checks to it, and well, let's just jump into the game. Turn 1, we do see the Dragalge against a Landorus, and the Landorus switches out into the Chansey, not wanting to fear a potential Scarf, and switches in on the Hippowdon. He Toxics the Hippowdon as the Hippowdon goes with Stealth Rock on the Chansey because he's not going to be doing too much to stop it, as the Landorus does switch back in. On the double into Pinsir, and Landorus is of course a pretty solid Pinsir check as far as Pinsir checks go. So Manapee City then go out into Skarmory and start stacking spikes. The U-turn shows that this is not Rocky Helmet Skarmory, it is leftovers, and we do see the first layer of spike go up as the Rotom Wash does come in. Now, this is a very free Volt Switch, and Dragalge will take it pretty easily. It's only 14%, but it does mean that he does keep up the momentum, goes out into his Hooper, which can take on the Dragalge pretty solidly. We do see the Hydreigon switch in on the Hyperspace Fury, and he crits him, which could have mattered. It would have been a rolled to-it KO as opposed to a guaranteed to-it KO, but he does choose to go out into his Chansey, not wanting to risk anything. As we see the U-turn on the Hydreigon, and the Skarmory comes back in on the Chansey and steps up a second layer of spike just to annoy it even more. As the Rotom comes in again, and the Volt switches again on the switch out into the Hippowdon this time, as it's obviously a ground type and blocks the Volt Switch, but not a very solid Rotom W answer, as he does end up making the switch out into his Hydreigon, just sacking it off at the point up to the Hydro Pump. And at this point, it's looking kind of like he's not got that much for Rotom. He does go out into his Dragalge, which can obviously OHKO it and deals with it. And the Chansey comes in and takes the Draco Meteor, only does 21%, and then just dies to a Dunk Shot being outsped. So that was very nice preparation, a mixed Dragalge had potential, and it did actually work this game. So we see the Hooper come in, crit the Hippowdon, which is again, that matters because we see from that damage that wouldn't have 2-it KO'd without it, but he does have the Grass Knot, so it was just affecting the mindset of Manapee at that point, probably. As he does go out into his Scizor and goes straight for the Frustration, just killing off the Hooper, not letting it get any more damage on the rest of his team, which it did outspeed the rest of. So we see Landorus versus Pinsir, and Skarmory switches in on the U-turn. And that it means it's a pretty free switch again for Rotom Wash to just Volt Switch around, annoy the rest of his team, because if there's one thing Rotom W does well, it's annoying people. The Dragalge comes in again, and it's Volt Switch, and it's now at 30%, which is not exactly the amount of health it wants to be at, especially when it's facing down the eyes of Kyurem. The Kyurem just goes for a nice free Ice Beam, kills the Dragalge, and because Manaphy had no switchings left to affect Kyurem, it just 2-KO'd everything. We do see the Ice Beam only does 36% to the Sylveon, so it can just go straight for the Hyper Voice as the Rotom W can come back in, go for the Hydro Pump, and 2-hit KO the Sylveon. As it narrowly avoids being dropped by the Hyper Voice. So now it's Pinsir versus the world, with the Skarmory in the back. It's only at 26%. He goes for the Frustration on the switch out into the Landorus, and he has to risk the game at this point. He has to go for the Sword Stance, hoping for a miss, and he goes for the Sword Stance. Rock Slide hits. And that's good preparation that we're using Rock Slide as opposed to Stone Edge, because of course it actually hits it, whereas Stone Edge would have hit for sure. And so the rest of the game is just him trying to kill the Skarmory, and he does end up managing to do so in the end. After his Landorus goes down, and the Voltaria manages to stall him out of Iron Heads with a combination of Substitute and Roost. So yeah, I think that was a pretty good game. From the part of the Colorado Avalanche. And Manaphy, I think his team was a little too passive against a Volt-Turn combination of Rotom Wash and the Landorus, and it was just consistently punished with that. I was very surprised that the Mew didn't come this week, just because of it's Mew. In my opinion, it's one of the best mons in the format. It's the most versatile mon there is, and I think that the Mew would have benefited him a little, but he did need everything else, and he ended up winning. So, oh well. Nice solid 2-0 victory for the Colorado Avalanche over the Manaphy City. What were your thoughts on this game, Dave?
I mean, both these teams look really balanced for each other, especially with Manaphy City being very entry hazard heavy, relying on that Skarmory a lot. Personally, I would have used Special Mega Altaria just because of how physically defensive a majority of the Manaphy City Pokemon are, instead of being mostly specially defensive. Well, just to deal with the major threats.
At the same time, however, you can point at specially offensive Altaria, and then you can point at the Sylveon, and then you can laugh. So it's a matter of what you want to beat on the opposing team, and he obviously thought he had more to take on the physically defensive Pokemon, the Skarmory and the Hippowdon, than he did to take on the Sylveon, and he'd try and avoid being walled by it as much as he could. But overall, I think this was a good game, and I think there were good games in general the entire week. The only game that I think was heavily influenced by hacks was, of course, the Hurricane Miss.
Still my favorite one, I swear.
for the Swampettes. And yeah, I do like. I think that all the games were pretty good this week, showcasing how good the NPL has gotten this season. There are no easy wins. That every game is going to be hard fought for. And yeah, I'm Pomman. Dave has been with me for this entire time. Thank you for putting up with me for your evening. And
me too.
We will see you next week to cover the games from week 2 of the NPL, and hopefully they're as good as the games that we've seen so far. Have a nice day.